ونص بعنوان اتساع
Our
مساحات
session today will be until 6:30, the expansion of the spaces for the uprising that we all witnessed, and we had a major discussion around it in terms if it is a different uprising of a new type in Palestine, particularly in terms of the participation of the Palestinians in 1948 occupied territories, including activists, parties,
كافة أطياف المجتمع
and all the society,
دخلته على القدس
that we saw how they went into Jerusalem in support of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood.
وحصل نقاش
And there
طويل
was that long discussion around this solidarity that everyone spoke of, and it was very well felt in terms of the solidarity or engaging all the Palestinian diaspora and across the borders. This uprising that re-established a new form of hope after many long years of despair and the Trump plan that placed the Palestinians in a very difficult political situation, as if the Jerusalem uprising came to re-establish hope. This session will discuss many issues to analyze this uprising. We have a number of specialists that we are proud to have them with us today, who will shed light and hands-on connection and experience as related to the media and tendencies of the media towards this uprising. We start with Dr. Honaida Ghanim, and this session will be more of just scientific papers, but they will be more of interactive ideas, new ideas, new visions on the Jerusalem uprising, and there will be discussion by the different participants, and we will be receiving your feedback and Q&A.
12 دقيقة حتى يكون هناك
Every
وقت
speaker will have 10 to 12 minutes so that we can have time for your extremely important questions in this session. Due to the large number of participants, we prefer that anyone who has any question to write it in the Q&A box, and we will address most of the questions. That's why we have allocated enough time for this. We start with Dr. Honaida. Dr. Honaida is the Director General of the Palestinian Center for the Studies, Madar. She has a PhD in sociology from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, 2005. She specialized in cultural and political sociology. She has a number of publications on the policies of colonialism in Palestine and the role of the Palestinian scholars and Judaism and culture and nationality in Israel, and she's a friend of the IPS. We always like to listen to her. Dr. Honaida, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot to my colleague and friend. I am always happy to participate in all the activities of the Palestinian Institute of Studies, Institute of Palestinian Studies. This issue of uprising, there was a lot of discussion, and we can take it from different perspectives. We are we teach in the academic area, and you look at the issue, and maybe you think maybe from a sociological point of view, we can analyze to see, understand why this uprising took place at this given moment when we had that feeling of despair as if we had no hope, had that darkness. What is the justification that led to exploding the situation the way it happened? And this might take us to different areas. Maybe we can look at it from beyond the sociological analysis. And as a result of this engagement, moral engagement that we have, or ethical engagement, as scholars, Palestinian scholars, who suffer the occupation and this pain of fear and despair. Despair is painful, in fact. What can we take from what happened as tools to assist us to overcome the situation that we are facing? And maybe we are very interconnected. I will try to discuss this, meaning that if you look at the events, you will understand that in 1948 areas, except for the Al-Aqsa Intifada that had some solidarity, this is the first time for the Palestinians in 1948 do not suffice themselves with solidarity with the Palestinian cause and Palestinians, but they are the ones who was leading the struggle and practicing the struggle. So they turned into the center of the event after that center was outside in Besapora, West Bank and Gaza. But this time they became the center of events. I don't say that this is related to, from a sociological point of view, the Palestinian national action in 1948 is not a coincidence. It did not come out of the blue, but rather it is connected to the development in the Zionist project itself and the Zionist colonial project. It was a project that was that somehow succeeded in achieving itself until 1967, started gradually turning from the logic of colonial state into that logic of settler Judaism state. So from a settlement project in the West Bank and again in 1948 areas. So these Palestinians in 1948 areas, they found themselves in facing something that they thought they finished, that is turning to citizenship. That is facing the settler returning from West Bank to Israel to occupy the houses and the spaces where the Palestinians are through the Talmudic verses. That is the developments in the Zionist project and the developments in its practices, and what we called more than once the ascension of Third Israel, turning to more of a theological state and nationalist Judaism. I mean, this turned into developments, unleashed developments across Palestine. What happened is that the development or participation or melting or eroding borders or eroding the green line, it was not just a Palestinian informed choice, but rather part of interactions of developments within the Zionist project itself that led to eroding these borders. And we speak about eroding these borders, the green line, and this is somehow painful, or that as it became part of a reaction to the developments in the Zionist project that does not consider or respect any borders or green line. And so all of this resulted that all the Palestinian people into turning into rephrasing the Palestinian struggle. And until a given point, and Palestinians were moving as in different groups. These there was reshuffling of the borders and to have a new center bringing these national projects together. Just to clarify a point, what happened? These dynamics are connected with different internal contradictions. Yes, we are having this uprising and erosion of these borders as if we Palestinians in 1948 areas we turned into a center. So the Palestinians practice struggle as one bloc. So much these internal contradictions, what happened in October Uprising resulted into a reaction for that turned into these developments. This way, when we say in Palestine, we say this is the Palestinian identity. At the same time, we are speaking about developments in the Palestinian society towards speaking of the individual solution and separation between politics and so forth. At the same time, if we look at the parallel experiences in the West Bank and in Gaza, we find that there is a state of, or there are contradicting factions that might tend to go to extend the period of, at the end of the day, I don't see this situation that we are having that is privatizing the Palestinian cause. This will not continue, but they might tend to extend this period, this interim period for more and more time. To wrap up, I can say in 2 words, what happened in 1948 was not just a Palestinian decision, because we have studied and came to this experience. No, there were dynamics and developments and the Zionist project that turned the solutions that Israel was trying to speak about, turned them into being irrelevant, because the settlement or settlers are now returning to Israel proper and through different projects. And the other thing is that we were acting on the basis of having parallel national projects. This moment have open space to reintegrate these projects into a more attractive central project, but we need to take into consideration that there are different factions that are contradicting, might take us into a different direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Honaida. I would like to continue with Mohammed El-Kurd, but I will finish up from where I will start from where Honaida finished up in her final conclusion. Do you, Mohammed, see what Honaida mentioned in terms of that this was not a Palestinian decision, that people decided that we are going to have this uprising and this is our plan but it was a result of dynamics of a Zionist project that is in transformation, and as a result of internal contradictory streams and trends. Since you were on the ground and you were in a personal place for you, but before you answer, I want to introduce you to the audience. Mohammed El-Kurd is a Palestinian writer and poet from Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem. He is now preparing for his MA in the US before going back to Sheikh Jarrah to protest the forced eviction of the residents and his own family from the neighborhood. And he was considered by the Israeli occupation and attacked by them. Muhammad will publish his first book, which is a collection of poems soon. Muhammad, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. I am proud to be here today, and I thank Dr. Honaida for her valuable insights. I agree and disagree at the same time. Of course, colonization and occupation impacts in terms of the obliteration of Palestinian identity inside 1948 territories played a major role, whether they were tangible policies in terms of stealing of lands, confiscation of lands and homes in Jaffa and Haifa, or Israelization and Judaization policies in Shafa Amr, that's the city of Shafa Amr. But what led this uprising to transcend the boundaries is that it was not hierarchical. And this is something that we've witnessed during the first and second intifadas uprisings, but there was always a parallel voice that identified itself with the uprising, a leadership voice that is clarifying what Palestinians are doing to the international community. However, today the Palestinian National Authority, as it was obvious to the Palestinian people, is a failed institution and entity, and was unable to identify itself with the recent uprising in Jerusalem. And therefore, the project and the initiative was non-hierarchical. Everybody did whatever they wanted, and it had unprecedented success. Of course, there were many challenges that result from a non-hierarchical struggle project in terms of lack of organization, but there are many lessons learned from this. And I believe the youth, wherever they are, have imposed on the institutions, particularly Palestinian institutions, the use of a new discourse in terms of describing the events that were unfolding. And as such, the ceiling was raised today. We refuse to reduce the discussion to settlement activities and 1967 borders. We are talking today about colonization, a settler colonial project. We are talking about genocide, ethnic cleansing, and we're talking about different apartheid policies without using the terms that do not describe really the situation on the ground. The new Zionism, in addition to the lack of hierarchy and the fact that the youth imposed a new discourse, led to this uprising in Jerusalem. And then the other new thing that we've seen was the armed resistance in Gaza that took measures and steps in response to what was happening in Jerusalem. This is something that we did not witness before. We didn't see people in Gaza respond to what was happening in Jerusalem before. And this shows that we are uniting in an unprecedented manner. I wanted to talk today about steadfastness and the challenges that we're facing. But for the audience that are with us today, I think this is something that is very well understood, very known. Everybody is aware of Palestinian resilience and steadfastness. And therefore, I want to talk in the last 5 minutes that are allocated to me to talk about the prices that we had to pay as a result of this uprising. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people who were raising this Palestinian Palestinian ceiling of demands everywhere around the world. We saw a lot of allies who are coming to talk to us and who for years feared to talk about the Palestinian question and did not even find the vocabulary, the terms that they needed to talk about it. But today this has changed, but at the same time, we've seen prices that people had paid, those who are affiliated with the poorer, the more marginalized segments of the society. For example, inside 1948 territories, we've seen more than 2,000 people were arrested. Many are still incarcerated in Akko. Today, we see many people, scores of people who are still being incarcerated on the background of their involvement in the uprising, and we don't have the mechanisms to address these heavy prices. We don't have the society system to address it. And of course, in 1948 territories, there was the establishment of a fund, the Fund for Freedom and Dignity, that is collecting money to pay for the fines and for bailing the people out of the prison. But we are seeing many things happening in Jerusalem in 1948 territories, but they are not as solid as we'd imagine or would want to see. But maybe in the coming years, we need to develop popular committees as well that could get rid of the Israeli system and establishment, whether culturally or socially, and also face up to the Israeli establishment in the aftermath of any uprisings or events that take place. I was arrested. I don't want to say arrested. I was just detained for a few hours, and together with my sister. And after, when we were released, there was a huge solidarity from the people. But what was concerning to us is that the solidarity with the people was as a result of building a media character, a figure that is known through the media. People know that person. This is how you build your image, and is as a symbol maybe. And therefore, we saw a lot of solidarity internationally. Even diplomats were intervening, and different channels talking to Israel when we were only detained for a few hours. But we know that Murad Atiyah from Sheikh Jarrah, 25 years old. He is a teacher in one of the municipality schools. He teaches Arabic language, and he was at the epicenter of the uprising from A to Z. He was all the time engaging in the protests. He was always waiting for prisoners who were detained by Israel, but we don't see anything about him being arrested. We don't see any media uproar for those who are arrested in Akko. And this takes me to another challenge that we are facing. We see, for example, in the Mohammed El-Kurd case or Ahd al-Tamimi case, we see that there is a failed leadership that is the Oslo leadership. And the international opinion and the public opinion are creating symbols for people to identify with, whether myself, my sister, or Ahd. But these are not leading figures in the institutional sense of the word, or the power that is entailed in terms of a leader. And therefore, the uprising is not sustainable, and we don't see the same impact for the other prisoners. And I don't have an answer for this challenge, but we need to see how we can shed light on those who are on the margins, who are marginalized, who do not have a voice through social media, those who are not loved by TV cameras. How can we maintain this momentum and when people who are marginalized and probably not very well known to the public are arrested? And how can we maintain the momentum when we are not, there aren't rockets being fired, but we can maintain a momentum? And thank you again for hosting me. I'm here to learn from all the other speakers. Thank you, Mohammed. But since your question, your last question, first of of all, thank you for sharing with us your personal story. And I think it is very important in terms of what is happening these days. Sometimes the act of arrest is more highlighted depending on the person who's being arrested rather than the arrest act itself, or why it is happening and what is its background. And therefore, what you've mentioned is crucial, that the issues remain public rather than personalized, rather than creating icons or symbols. I'm glad that you are aware of this issue. That is very important. And if Adnan Abu Amr allows me, that since we're talking about the media and in the way Muhammad concluded through his question, I want to take that question to Muhammad, Dr. Muhammad Abu Rub, who is a Palestinian academic and researcher who focuses on analyzing the media discourse. He has a PhD in media from Vienna University in 2013. Currently, he is a professor of media at the Birzeit University. He's been in this position for the last 10 years. Doctor, what do you think of what Muhammad said at the end of his speech and how the media captures certain moments and turns certain people into heroes, but does not continue to shed light on the cases of other people who are being arrested and does not take it to become a question of public opinion? Thank you. Thank you for all the participants, all the audience today. In any case, in the past, we used to suffer from that foreign traditional media to the lack of coverage of the media question, meaning that there are clashes between Palestinians and Israelis that led to this and that. The Palestinian incidents would come in the foreign media, maybe not misleading, but rather without a context. Why are there clashes? How did they take place? Where is the human dimension of the media stories? And so these details did not come through. But now with the social media and the new media, there is a larger space for reaction and for emotion. And this is linked to the human stories, the stories of suffering, personal suffering that are more common and people can identify with. And this, I will continue on what Muhammad said. I'm not against these examples. Muna, who is a graduate of media department from Birzeit University, and Muhammad, these are good examples and good tools to highlight the issues. Bella Hadid and the information and the messages that she was conveying. Maybe somebody would describe her as somebody who's engaged in the entertainment and in the industry and the consumption of new media, but these consumption of the new media in terms of crisis and also at the time of the uprising came back to recreate and regenerate a new public opinion around the world in support of the Palestinian question. So let us ask the reverse question. If Muna or Muhammad were not there, then many of the coverage and details would not have been captured. If you did not have a live broadcasting through your own mobiles, then many of the details could have been lost. This does not mean that there were years of people spent years struggling and giving of their time, but they did not come out in the media. But this is the problem of the media. Sometimes they would highlight certain people, certain characters, they will be interested, but then again, the light might shift away from them. But the uprising, how the Israelis saw it and how they saw the digital space and its transformations. And I also want to take about the hashtags, the tweeting. And the other point that I want to address is what can we do in the coming phase. I want to quote the spokesperson for the Israeli army, Roland Miles, who said that the state of Israel is losing the younger generation and also losing those who are convinced of their story. And therefore, we need to focus on those who are hesitant and reluctant. And we should not use propaganda only when there is a fire exchange. So if the occupier who has that power is interested in public relations and the media, then the Palestinian people who are the real victim here should publish and share their narrative and their stories. So it is very important. In Arabic, there's a difference between the uprising as such and what was happening in Jerusalem. And so this is the term in Arabic is habbe, that is not the full intifada in that sense. And so it was not planned, it was spontaneous, and it was important, but it is also temporary and has sustainable results. But how can we have the actions themselves sustainable and permanent so that we continue to affect the international public opinion? What were the transformations that happened as a result of social media under the recent uprising? I will give some statistics. In the US, sympathy with the Palestinian people increased in general in the last public opinion poll to 30%. And this was during the aggression on Gaza and during the Sheikh Jarrah events, neighborhood events. And Goal poll says that more than 80% of those, the respondents, believed that Palestinians were not the cause behind the war. Another opinion poll showed a reduction in the support for Israel, a decrease in support for Israel at an average of 15% in most of the European countries, mostly in the UK and France, and the least was in Germany. So decrease in support of evangelical Christians in the US to 33%, and half of them supported the establishment of a Palestinian state. Also, according to Gallup poll, 53% of US Democrats support pressure on Israel to engage in the peace process. So most of these polls show a relative transformation and change and shift in the international public opinion regarding the Palestinian narrative and the Palestinian context of the crisis. How did we reach to this level of sympathy? As a person who is focusing on social media, I am convinced that social media platforms have helped create this shift in the public, international public opinion, and that foreign media, whether biased to Israel in some, like Fox News and others, or relatively biased towards Israel, such as CNN Group, and other media groups in the US, but the new media and the social media overall have changed this general trend and attitude. For example, in May, with the hashtag Gaza under attack, at the culmination of the crisis, hashtag Gaza under attack, every 2 minutes, it reached 1 million people on Twitter alone. In each every minute, Palestinian stories were reaching 500,000 of people around the world through Twitter. Another example, in India, on the 13th of May, there was a hashtag, We Stand with Palestine. It was trending in India. And we know India, in terms of the density of the population and how huge it is, the hashtag We Stand with Palestine was trending for long hours. And Israel and supporters of Israel tried to do We Support Israel, but it did not reach India. Also on the 8th of May, the hashtag of Save Sheikh Jarrah reached on the 8th of May to become a trend in 35 countries around the world. And it was ranking second internationally for several hours to be the second hashtag trending around the world. And it was trending in 35 countries around the world. In this context, the hashtag, the social media, and there are many statistics that we could mention, but due to the limited time, I can postpone it to the discussion part of the session. But then we have two contexts. Then there is a shift in the international public opinion, at least 10% shift in some countries. in other areas it was higher. The hashtag and the tweets increased tremendously. But what is the solution? What do we have to do as Palestinian activists and foreign activists supporting Palestine? What should we do? The first is to understand the uprising and deconstruct what it was. And this is our problem with the occupation, is that the production of Palestinian content, usually it's seasonal, immediate, ad hoc, at the time of the crisis. It could have lasting impact, but how much it is being promoted and published, and it goes down. And so what people receive in terms of information over social media platforms, thus the Palestinian question starts to vanish gradually. Any story on social media can become trend and become a huge issue for a few days, and then another issue comes around and replaces it. And this requires us as Palestinians to have organized efforts on social media platforms. If Gaza under attack, if the bombardment stopped for a period of time, what do we do with that hashtag? We stop using it? No, we should use a permanent hashtag, which is end occupation, in addition to other hashtags such as Save the Sheikh Jarrah and Gaza under attack, which is a hashtag that can be used at all times, and hashtags that relate to temporary events. So reproducing the Palestinian media content and using short videos and using, if you could see, for example, the importance of how foreign activists supporting Palestinian question, the influencers, makeup artists, whether Bella Hadid and other Hollywood stars. Therefore, there is an urgent need to produce and distribution over social media platforms, whether through the Palestinian communities abroad, and to reproduce and recreate a Palestinian media content and disseminate it. Any Palestinian audience around the world can share media content that is translated into different languages according to the country that is being targeted, and this would reinforce the Palestinian discourse and story everywhere. So I am ready to answer any questions if you have later.
شكرا دكتور محمد، يعطيك العافية. كان المفروض معنا يكون الأستاذ عدنان من غزة، ولكن انقطع الاتصال، فإذا عاد الاتصال رح نرجع ناخده لمدة 10 أو 11 دقيقة.
Now we still have time. We should have had a connection with Mr. Adan from Gaza, but now each of the speakers has discussed a certain point. I have some questions sent to us, and I have my own questions based on the presentations. Honaida and Mohammed El-Kurd further clarified the uprising, its reasons. I have more than one question here that I am asking Honaida and Mohammed El-Kurd concerning if the uprising was not organized. How did it happen? In its daily repercussions, did it start by Mohammed El-Kurd, or how did it start? This is the how, not the why. Do we still have Mohammed El-Kurd? Would like to answer since you were on the ground, and then Dr. Ghanim. I cannot answer this question, but I can speak about Save Sheikh Jarrah campaign. We cannot take responsibility for the uprising, but what happened in Sheikh Jarrah since October last year, I remember, when the Israeli court, occupation court decision was for the displacement. I was in New York,
للشيخ جراح
and
وكان
we started that campaign for Sheikh Jarrah.
الهبة بشكل عام ما
And
كانت
yes, the uprising was not organized, but the campaign was organized that we started and built it on the footsteps of our people.
وهذا الشيء خلق كثير من المشاكل.
And this created several issues, in fact.
مع الجمهور وبحكي مع قيمة المحبة والاحترام
With all due respect to our people, this created problems with our people, such as and with the committees, such as the Sheikh Jarrah Committee, and with the Palestinian institutions in the US in particular, and Palestinian institutions in general. There was that internal conflict, there was lobbying and pressure on these organizations, that is, to allow us to use new tactics and to use a new terminology. When I was pressuring people to use ethnic cleansing, but there was rejection in general. And this required a lot of lobbying them and writing letters and telephone calls. And this was the first milestone for me. Not necessarily right, but for me, the milestone was to change the terminology in dealing with the events, because Sheikh Jarrah has been under the risk of displacement and evacuation since 1972, and we have been conducting campaigns such as in 2009, and it was not with this momentum that we have now. So this is my answer. And there was some organization that, especially in media, you are trying to create a certain equation. When Western media comes to speak with me, the CNN, I understand that CNN are very much interested in speaking with me. So naturally, a Palestinian invited to speak to the media because we consider this as good. But these times, there was something different. We started requesting to see the questions that will be asked and to place red lines for the news anchor. And we would reject to answer racist questions.
نتوقف على هذا السؤال ونشرح للناس.
And we'd explain to people why this question is left. So any Western or American citizen on his couch and watching these chains in the media, it's clear that where people stand, well, yes, with the victims, but people support and stand with the strong who have some agency that we can help you if you are at risk. As Palestinians going to the media, I believe this was a different organization. Honaida? Sometimes we feel despair when listening to news, but when we listen to Muhammad, then we get hope. Let's say, now it's difficult to speak in details how it happened, but what, please, yeah, move your microphone. I want to draw attention to an important point, which is the accumulation in Sheikh Jarrah uprising. I spoke in a very summarized way about the different Zionist projects. This is a settlers project entering the so-called mixed population cities in Israel, where there are Arabs or Palestinians trying to enter them from within, as they do with the Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. So this project in Sheikh Jarrah, it's the same in Yafa and Akka. And so if we look at Sheikh Jarrah, as in May, even 2 months before, not since a long time, events were exploding in Jaffa. Confrontation was around the same subject with a Madar company that tries to evacuate people from their homes, and the Torah groups that try to enter these houses and to displace Palestinian citizens from there. So this replacement of population is the same in Sheikh Jarrah and Jaffa and Ramle. So that's why this uprising has been across Palestine, because this sent us back to 1948, to the roots of the issue. This brought back to the issue, to the course 1948, to the issue of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians and so forth. So to look at issues from the overall image or picture, so that when we write around what happened in this uprising, if any historian writes around it, to remember that this uprising was not a bubble and one time off, but rather it was part of an overall general context. And when I say that, I need to add one point here. We cannot be focused in our discussion and discourse unless we rebuild the Palestinian identity. We are 12 million people. I would say 12 million people who have their own institutions, committees, and joint festivals. Unless we have this, we will remain weak. And you will see sometimes uprising in Jerusalem or elsewhere, or when they demolish Araqib. But if we are not this way, as 12 million people who are not practicing politics with this identity, we will remain poor and fragmented. And we can speak more about this, and not to say, okay, come for the two-state or one-state solution. No, let's build this Palestinian identity and to act as 12 million population and to discuss the politics. Do we want one or two-state solution? Honaida, if you want to look at one aspect, if you wish, that you are aware of as related to the Palestinians in 1948, and you started to speak about contradiction. There are several projects, and we see Israeli attempts to end the presence of our people in 1948. If we consider this as a segment of the population, in your vision, where do you see the possibilities for activism to start from with issues for Palestinians in Israel, the issues with the Israeli government as part of the Palestinian national movement? Many times our people in Israel proper are always too busy, and that's why this uprising is something strange. And as we are Palestinians very busy or too busy with our conflicts and with our internal or civil violence, if you wish. You know, I don't want to pinpoint one thing, but in recent years, the Palestinian struggle of Palestinian people had that feeling of center, that PLO was the center of events or central part for the Palestinian people. Even with the Palestinian Authority at a given point, it formed the nucleus of a given project or certain project, was a center somehow. Many years, the Palestinian people, they don't have a feeling But these are parallel projects without a center. PLO is gone, and so the PA is not doing the same as it did. But not only the Palestinian 48, also even Gaza are busy with issues that are life-related issues. And diaspora, no one is speaking about it, as if the Palestinians there do not belong. Now, as each group is acting or busy with its own individual issues, you cannot ask people to put aside their issues, their concerns, and to be busy with the overarching concerns. But these daily concerns that we are facing are the product of the national issue. Just take one thing: violence among the Arabs and Palestinians inside. Even this violence is somehow far away from the national issues. Since January until this day, 72 people were killed due to organized crime. Is this a civil issue? Is this a social issue? This has to do with the state issue. Even the police and the Israeli Shabak, they say Shabak protects these criminals. So these are collective issues that bring people together. So again, if there is no attempt to unify the Palestinian people and to act as a one entity, again, to clarify, when I say let's agree at minimum lines, what are the basic things that we can agree on? End the occupation, the right to return, the equality. So this is all the Palestinians, wherever they are, agree around them. So let's agree on these issues and try to see how we can work for that. And each group or segment will be the strategic support for the other segment. But until this day, each segment of the Palestinian population is acting individually and separately. The May uprising gave indication to the potential for the Palestinian collective action, gave an indication. And now, today, when I look at the situation I'm having, this is indication that we are fragmented. What can we do? Zero. That's it. Thank you. Honaida? It's clear that this is a major question, but we need to return to hope, and more than hope, it's a reality that this uprising gave to us, that there is a possibility to overcome all these contradictions at given points. Every Palestinian is individually very immersed and busy with their issues. Even Palestinians in diaspora are facing even more difficult situation. But I need to make a question, because I'm receiving so many questions here from different people in Arabic and English on an issue that Muhammad mentioned, and issues related to that, which is the concept of forming popular committees. In the last 3 years, personally, I was in conferences related to Palestinian cause, to the Palestinian cause, and issues of third world people, how to save themselves against attacks by different dictatorships and occupations. There is a tendency to speak about the concept of popular committees, especially under occupation. And in recalling and revisiting what happened in the first Intifada, that is national solidarity. And as Dr. Muhammad mentioned, And we have from the media different tools. Now, and this is connected to what happened with Honaida.
لجان شعبية هذا واحد من الأسئلة والأسئلة للجميع يعني للدكتور
One of the questions is there is a need for popular committees. So the first part of the question, is there a possibility, in fact, to revive or establish popular committees from a different perspective? And the other part of the question or the questions that we are receiving, many of them are coming in English about the role of Palestinians in the diaspora in this kind of a movement, this uprising, and even about the possibility of creating a body that represents Palestinians in the diaspora in order to mobilize support for the activism and the uprisings inside Palestine. So these are questions about the role of Palestinians outside Palestine in such activism. So maybe we can pose this question first to Dr. Mohammed Abu Rub. The questions are grouped. I believe popular committees can be twofold in reality, in the neighborhoods, on the ground. And we've seen that when we saw the Palestinian youth in Jerusalem, in the neighborhoods, calling for others to come and help out. And as a result of media influencers or young activists in Jerusalem were issuing these calls, and people would come and support, and also virtual committees. So we have the ones on the ground that confront the settlers, that document the attacks, and then the virtual committees that disseminate information about that in different languages around the world. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a delegation of Palestinians living in Latin America, some of whom do not even speak Arabic, but they have a sense of belonging to Palestine in their traditions, and they wanted Palestinian platforms in Spanish so that they produce information and videos that are translated into Spanish for them to follow up on what was happening. And so there were Palestine broadcast. They were Spanish, Russian, French languages, and these kinds of pages were very active. And I'm one of the people who supervises and helps these pages in order to produce and disseminate Palestinian media content in different languages. And there are several platforms such as International Communities Against Israel, Breaking the Silence, Palestinian Lives Matter, Eye on Palestine, and other platforms and groups and pages, international communities. Dr. Muhammad, allow me to interrupt you, but these pages, and I was also part of this discussion, whether these groups that are supporting and these multiple pages that are supporting the Palestinian question, it seems like these efforts are not organized, like organizing. Is there a vision of how we can use the virtual space, the online space to create some sort of an uprising? Maybe it's an exaggeration to say uprising, but to talk about a strategic tactic uprising through the online platforms. For example, we know underground, to have uprisings that are successful, there needs to be organization. And we know that all uprisings that they were not organized, even major revolutions, if they lacked the organization, they would end. So would there be an organization of these kinds of virtual uprisings, if you want, through these different pages? That is why we are talking about a spontaneous act and not something strategic or organized. But even in the events that happened in Jerusalem recently, there was a lot of international sympathy, and we were able to reach 2 million people on Twitter every 2 minutes. And so there was an increased media awareness and awareness in general. So how did that reflect on the ground? Some of the groups and some of the pages, people were redirected or were called upon to join certain protests, for examples, or sit-ins. and in some and they were publishing documents or information about protests at certain times in certain cities in different countries, and that increased the number of people who joined the different protests around the world in support of the Palestinian question. And we saw for the first time rallies that had a 250,000 of people or 500,000 of people in the US and the UK, something that was unprecedented. And therefore, I agree that there needs to be bodies like BDS expand their work, for example, and scope of activities. And these bodies that should continue to produce content, because we have a problem with the flow of information. And we do not have a sufficient production of information to the media, because we are governed and by the international foreign media that has its own policies. And therefore, we need to have the pumping of information, if you want, at the international level, take opportunity of certain national moments, certain national days in certain countries. And that is why Palestinians in the diaspora are very important in terms of resharing of the media content, Palestinian content, and not to overlook the importance of social media. So I want to talk from this very narrow angle of social media. And I believe that it is very important. Otherwise, Israel would not, as a state of occupation and occupier, would establish their own pages in different countries around the world. Israel's Facebook page in the Philippines has 75,000 followers, and this is affiliated with the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs. And Philippines is not a leading country around the world in terms of policies at the international level. But Israel was keen on presenting its image from its own colonial perspective, even to countries that did not have that much weight in the international scene. And this is why it is important to have alliances with democratic, progressive political parties who support human rights around the world in order to mobilize support for the Palestinian question. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for these insights. I think you were brief and to the point, and the answer was very specific to the answer that was posed. Mohammed El-Kurd. I don't want also to take long, because I cannot answer all the question as such. There is an elephant in the room that is not being addressed, whether in terms of popular committees or leaders abroad in the diaspora. It is clear what the main obstacle to that, and that is the Palestinian National Authority. We are facing a huge impediment, which is the Palestinian National Authority. The Palestinians in the diaspora cannot go to the Palestinian embassy to discuss certain contents or requirements or protests, because there is a body that represents the Palestinian people, and everybody is waiting for a word from that body, and usually it is absent, or it is a very weak. There are rallies that had hundreds of thousands of people that we saw in London, in the US. They did not come out of nowhere. They had Palestinian organizers behind them and mobilizers who were able to mobilize these people. And they will not replace the PA, but if we look at the Zionist project, we know that Zionists had international representation even before Israel was established, and they had some form of legitimacy that is now currently only reduced to the PA for us as Palestinians. Of course, what I'm saying is I may be idealistic, because we're only 2 months away from the killing of Nizar Banat, and we saw what was happening on the ground in Ramallah, whereby people were demanding for the dismantling of the PA, and now it is people demanding elections. So there's a division even among those protesters. Some were calling for the dismantling of the PA, and others are calling for reform through conducting of elections. And therefore, we need to have some form of agreement, consensus among us as 12 million Palestinians. and the most and foremost thing to agree on is that if the PA we don't want to dismantle, then it has to be revamped and reshaped and reformed, because they are not undertaking their duties on the ground. Muhammad, while you were in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood as part of this uprising, how much did you coordinate with political actors outside Palestine, whether Palestinians or non-Palestinians? It was a lot of coordination, in fact, with many people. At one point, as residents of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, we told people, do what you want and we will support you, but we don't have the capacity to have strategic meetings with everyone. But there was a lot of groups and movements, Al-Auda organization, Palestinian Youth Movement, everywhere in Palestinian diaspora, there was a lot of activities going on. Sheikh Jarrah residents were always being updated and informed about them. But Muhammad, me as Mohammed El-Kurd, I was maybe aware of the tactics and the things that we would be using.
في كل دولة من الدول.
بس سؤال أخير عن جيش كتير.
Last question, it's also many questions about the PA and their role in this uprising. Did you coordinate with them? Was there any kind of support from the PA? Of course, the PA is funding one of our lawyers, is funding one of the lawyers that are defending the Sheikh Jarrah residents and who is representing us before Israeli courts. Also, the PA had tried to climb and become opportunistic to take to seize the opportunity to climb over the backs of the people who were engaged in the uprising. And when I say that, my parents would tell me, but what about the lawyer? The lawyer is being funded by them. But this was their mere role. And they try to do a lot of things as a result of that. So we're talking about the PA. I'm not an expert, but if I have 60% of the people in the West Bank are getting paid by the PA. Whenever a Palestinian is killed, is martyred, or Israeli soldiers kidnap a Palestinian, the PA pays money for their families and support their families. But this is a role that is a very minimal. It is becoming only a financial role. And I'm not saying that it is a negative role, but as a PA, which is also the representative of the Palestinian people, you are only doing one thing of so many others that you need to do for the Palestinian people. And this is my criticism of the PA. I hope that they will not assassinate me as a result of that. I agree. If we go into a discussion of what is happening with the PA and what we're seeing now, I don't know what I can add to what we've written and what we've said everywhere we were hosted or invited. That Israel wants to a role. Maybe you don't want to do this role or perform it, but we see that you are domesticated somehow. You are in a way forced to do a certain role, or otherwise you will disappear. PA wants Israel wants PA to be a mediator between Israel and the Palestinian population, and so it becomes a service provider for the people. Or social welfare services to the families who are in need, and so on and so forth, but that the PA will not undertake its role, which is the main role, which is the struggle for the ending of the occupation and the working towards Palestinian independence. To be frank, I think we are in an impasse and often I try to think, how can we overcome this? How can we get out of the situation we find ourselves in? whereby the price is not very costly. Is a price that people can afford for overcoming this impasse. And if we don't agree, again, I repeat it, if we don't agree on the minimum and try as 12 million people to strive towards achieving these minimum requirements, so we will remain fragmented. But for the international world, with the Palestinians abroad, you talked about Palestinian solidarity in general. I did not talk about Palestinian solidarity. I talked about Palestinian acts as a Palestinians, maybe the 1948 territories, it is the strategic dimension for the West Bank and so on and so forth, especially when the Arab world around us have become a world where is a deterrent, is weakening our positions. We talk about 6 out of 21 Arab countries who have full diplomatic relations with Israel, in addition to other Arab countries who are in their own crises and bloodshedding and battles. So Palestinians, the 12 million Palestinians, is the source of power. We have to practice politics as 12 million Palestinians. The PLO continues to be present. I don't want to address a lot of conflicts and discussions and controversy about how to change and reform the PLO. I say, let's do a Palestinian Congress that represents all Palestinians. This is not a replacement of the PLO. This Palestinian Congress should not necessarily take political decisions regarding Palestinian struggle, but can take decisions about how to reinforce and strengthen Palestinian presence and existence, establish a Palestinian fund, for example, to support different programs, different projects. I don't want to address political issues because I'm sure many people will be embarrassed, or people from 1948 territories will be embarrassed and do not even want to enter in a Palestinian National Liberation Project that somebody from the diaspora would say, for example, to do certain things, and those who are inside 1948 territories do not want it because they know what is available to them. And so in order to overcome this, we can have this comprehensive framework. And this is something that I'm not the first to talk about. Kamil Mansour and others talked about the Palestinian Congress that represents everyone, but we talk and talk about it, and things are then forgotten and neglected. As for Palestinians in the diaspora, the most they can do, the things that Palestinians are threatened by the most is their existence. Palestinians are threatened in Jaffa, in Akko, in Jerusalem. So this will allow, for example, Israelis to build 1,000 settlement units in return for some settlement units for Palestinians.
So supporting the Palestinian existence is the basic thing that the diaspora can do, in addition to all the political support, but the support for the financial support for the Palestinian existence, projects to support Palestinian resilience and steadfastness, because our presence on the ground is the most important thing. Thank you, Dr. Honaida. Now, I would like to point out that Dr. Adnan Abu Amr, he is unable to join us because of internet issue, which is a practical representation to the situation in Gaza. Mr. Adnan Abu Amr was supposed to speak about the resistance strategy. Now we are almost approaching the end of our session, but there is an important point that Mr. Adnan was about to fill this gap. This uprising that started by all Palestinians but turned to military resistance, and this turned to Gaza, and we saw what happened later on. How to understand the issue of rockets fired from Gaza and their relation with the daily uprising. Should the response or continuing the popular action through military action or not? This was supposed to be answered by Dr. Adnan. I know that the speakers have something to add to this. Since we can open the floor for a minute for any of you who would like to add, to speak about military resistance. I know there was a long discussion around it. And we saw this on Facebook and in reality. By the way, I can speak about this if you wish, although when I spoke about it, I was attacked. I believe not necessarily you always have the right. I mean, it's not the issue that I have a right. If I have a right according to international law or not. But in a certain given moment of practice, is this good for you or not? I believe that the popular resistance, if it continued, it would have more stronger potential for impact and effect. And if you could achieve things at any given moment, this at a strategic level and a general feeling what is happening or what is given to me. Is this good for me or not? I personally believe that the Palestinian can benefit the most from the popular struggle, peaceful struggle. This can be most beneficial more than any other form of struggle. So the issue is not if I have right or not, but it is the smart use of the most suitable means. This is my point of view. Okay, as we said, if I want to represent the other views, hopefully Mr. Adnan will cover this. Resistance in Gaza for the first time used new tools or technical tools to hit Israel this form or that form. Sometimes this military language is necessary to divert conflict into a different direction, even if sometimes at the expense of popular uprisings. And the discussion that's going around, which is, as mentioned by Dr. Muhammad, are we an uprising or just a temporary one? The strange thing is that the Palestinian uprising has been called uprising in 1987, and it was called uprising after it started. While we noticed the Jerusalem uprising was immediately called this way, as we know that it is a temporary immediate one because of the settlement and circumstances, as mentioned by Honaida and the American vision, as if this placed us in a position to see that everything as short term. But this is part of the discussion that was discussed in several conferences about the concept of ongoing catastrophe or Nakba. And these uprisings since 1700 ongoing since that time and ending with facing the Israeli colonialist project. These are not detached events. It is the issue of a colonialist structure that invites stronger and longer uprisings, but sometimes the uprisings, because of circumstances, they come up strong, then wane and get weaker. And we saw for a few years the what was called the revolution of knives, then something new came up. This is the ongoing Nakba. We hope that this Nakba one day will end. And I believe if we continue studying and criticizing, as Dr. Honaida mentioned, and understanding the role of the media, as Dr. Mohammed El-Kurd mentioned, and understand the role of political activists, as Mr. El-Kurd mentioned, then we Palestinians, we can do something important in understanding and analyzing our daily reality, because through the IPS that gives us this platform, and we hope always to have these discussions. I thank you for your participation.
دكتور محمد أبو الرب
Dr. Mohammed El-Kurd, there were questions for you. We can review related to the privacy of information, how activists can protect their privacy, which is an important subject. We're going to speak about security for political activists who are facing this high exposure of their identity, and this has a great impact for preventing having new uprisings, because this new media has the other face of revealing and exposing political activists, and this is worth a separate seminar.